we have almost no litigation, almost no lawsuits. It's very low nuisance value stuff, less than 30 grand a year, as opposed to multi-million dollars. And this is a very large organization. And we have acceptance and understanding and support and trust that has been built with the unions, with the employees, with the managers. It's a win-win across the organization.
That's Rachel Shaw, president of Shaw HR Consulting. She's a seasoned HR expert who helps organizations shift from fear-based compliance to people-first, legally sound strategies that build strong workplace cultures. Rachel has 20 years of executive HR experience, and she's the author of The Disabled Workforce: What the ADA Never Anticipated. In that book, she provides practical guidance to HR and risk professionals. I'm Marilyn Germain, the host and producer of the Dear Human Resources podcast. In this episode, Rachel is going to talk about why the ADA is more than legal red tape. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. It's so great to be here, Marilyn.
So some of our listeners are not based in the United States. So let's talk a little bit about the ADA itself. Can you tell our listeners what it is and its purpose?
The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990 with George H.W. Bush as our president and a bipartisan Congress support. And it was legislation that followed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and focused on removing barriers for persons with disabilities to, in Title I of the ADA, to access work. And so I focus on people with disabilities who have the ability to do the work. So this isn't developmental disabilities or folks that may not be able to comprehend or perform the work. But this law was focused on removing both physical barriers, making sure someone who might be in a wheelchair or might have mobility limitations was able to use a ramp and get on a bus to get to the workplace. And when they got to the workplace, that there were ramps or elevators, for example. And then once employees got into the workplace, the focus was how to support them to be accommodated reasonably, meaning how do we remove unnecessary barriers so people with disabilities that have the skills, abilities, and knowledge to do your work weren't being disenfranchised or kept out of the workplace. And the focus was really looking at what many of us think of as physical disabilities. This law was passed and it was being pushed as we were coming out of the Vietnam Wars. We had veterans and people with physical limitations, hearing and sight impairments. And so in the beginning, the ADA really focused on those types of disabilities. Over time, of course, that's changed, which is, harkens to the title of my book. But really, the ADA now focuses on disabilities and increasing access for people with disabilities in the workplace that might pertain more to workers' compensation injuries, psychological disabilities, neurodivergence, and other types of invisible disabilities that the ADA really didn't comprehend back when it was originally passed in 1990.
So glad you mentioned mental disabilities, emotional disabilities, because that's fully part of the ADA. Now, you say that the ADA can be legal red tape. Can you expand on that?
For a lot of employers, they see the ADA as a compliance obligation, which it is. It's a legally mandated law that most employers in the United States, if they have 15 or more employees, must comply with it. And some states have even added carry-on laws where if you have 3 or more employees, you have to comply with the ADA. But the idea is that it's a compliance obligation. It's a requirement. And if you don't do it the right way, if you don't, there's 2 obligations, essentially. Employers must engage in what's called a timely good faith interactive process, and that process needs to lead them to making what are called reasonable accommodation decisions. They have to do both. And if they don't do both and they get sued, they'll lose. And if they lose, there's not only impact to reputation, but there can be very expensive lawsuits. State by state, you might see larger lawsuits than others, but it is a legal obligation where they have included in that, to give it some teeth, an actual financial impact to employers. And so unfortunately, a lot of employers really look at it as a negative, right? Someone is asking for something and now I have to do something. And if I don't do it in the right way, then I could get sued and get in trouble. And so a lot of times employers really approach it from more of a risk management standpoint than from more of a traditional human resources or disability inclusion standpoint, which is, of course, the secondary goal of the law, which is to increase access, not just mandate employers remove barriers.
Rachel, what do you think most organizations misunderstand about the ADA and its purpose?
The goal of the ADA is not to mandate or force employers to lower job requirements. It doesn't give disabled people more rights than non-disabled people. Really, what the ADA says is that, look, there is a power differential in all workplaces. Employers have more power than employees. That is just kind of a known. And the ADA's goal is not to force employers to have to hire people that are less qualified, that can't perform the work, or even maintain employees. What it says is we're going to mandate a process, a timely, good faith interactive process, with the idea that employers are going to need to look at and treat disabled people as equal partners to the process. And that instead of allowing an employer to use their power, for example, let's say a custodian has been injured at work and has a no heavy lifting restriction. Employers have more power to define no heavy lifting. An employer or supervisor could say, oh, you're a custodian, you can't do heavy lifting, we can't accommodate. And they could either, if there isn't another job they can transfer them into, they could fire them. And what the law says is that's insufficient. An employer has to use a timely good faith interactive process, that legal mandate, to simply ensure that decisions are not being made based on the employer's ability to use bias, perception, or opinion to decide whether or not they actually can reasonably accommodate. And it requires an employer to say, look, I don't know what heavy means. They can guess, but they might be guessing wrong. And the employee, they're also not able to guess or say what that term means. A healthcare provider or doctor needs to define it. And so what the ADA wants is not to force the employer to have to make a decision that impacts their business. They want to require employers identify and realize their power differential, use the interactive process to gather data so that data can drive decision making, which allows more people with disabilities to have equal access to employment. Not more, not preferential, but equal. And so by using good sound practice, by gathering data, instead of making a decision on whether or not you can accommodate a custodian who has a heavy lifting restriction, instead you use process to gather information where you might get they can lift 20 pounds with their right arm, unrestricted with their left arm in lifting. And when they use both arms, they can lift 40 pounds. Now, that is data that can be analyzed and evaluated against the job requirement, where a clear decision, a yes or a no, can be found. And it equalizes that power differential where a supervisor, if they really like that custodian, would say, yep, absolutely, I can accommodate, right? And if they either don't like the employee, or if maybe that supervisor is what we call old school and has sort of a belief of full duty or no duty, right? A lot of us are in work environments where we see or hear that from some of our supervisors. Instead of allowing that decision to be made based on that opinion, preference, or belief of that supervisor, what HR has done is we have gathered data that has allowed us to say yes if it actually is reasonable, meaning the employee can do their job fully and safely. And if they can't, if the job requires regular lifting of 50, 60 pounds, and it's clear that by not doing that lifting, that there's certain duties that they can't perform, then we know we've gotten to a no. But it's a clear analytical decision. It's a data-based decision instead of preference, emotion, or bias being used. That's the goal of the ADA. Bring data into your decision making so that we are giving people equal access to the benefits and burdens of employment.
So, speaking of HR leaders, what can they do to reframe the ADA from a legal obligation to a culture building tool?
Everything that you're doing in the interactive process has the opportunity to impact relationships or enhance them. And so, for example, in the protocol that I train my clients and I work with my clients on, we use a 4-step protocol. And in that 4-step protocol, there are 2 key conversations, 4 pieces of paper, 4 steps, and 1 meeting. And every single activity that you are doing in that interactive process, those 2 key conversations, that 1 meeting, the documentation, the goal of that is to increase awareness, understanding, and acceptance of decisions. You are not going to be able to accommodate as an employer and as an HR leader. You are not, unfortunately, going to be able to accommodate every person with a disability. There will be people whose disabilities are too great and they can't safely and fully do their job, or their leave needs are so great that it's not reasonable. And employers are going to have to say no. They're going to have to consider medical separation or termination of disabled people. That is a fact. But what employers really need to do is understand that when they are engaging in this process, they're coming to a request or a need for accommodation with the goal that if we can find a yes, we're going to do the work to gather the data to implement it. And I will tell you that intent, what the law calls good faith, right? That intent can be felt and it can be seen in your process and the actions you take or don't take. The goal is to help employees understand, we've got your back. We want to help you. But there are rules. We have equal work for equal pay provisions in some employers. We have a need to get work done. There's only so many things we can do. And so by having those conversations, oftentimes what you find is that employees will trust and believe and understand that they actually work for an employer who is willing to do work, to try to gather the data, to try to find that yes. And if you find one, it shows and proves to organizations that you're going to use data instead of bias, belief, or preference to guide decisions for a class of people who need their employer to help them. And when you can't find a yes, you will see not only with the employee, but those that are watching you. Because look, everything we do in HR is not just about that one employee. You get the worst or best PR on how you treat one employee because people are watching you. Am I going to be treated fairly if I needed that? Do they really care about me? Is this a place I should stay? And so when you treat people with respect, when you lower the power differential by letting data guide decision making, when you explain to employees why you're getting to this yes or this alternative yes, maybe they want to work from home, but instead you found a way to support them to safely do their job in person, right? It's not always about giving them what they want, but explaining why this accommodation is better for the organization, is more reasonable, etc. What you do is you build this culture and this belief that, look, at the end of the day, my company has to run a successful business. They have to get the work done. They have to have equal work environments. However, they're going to work with me. They value me, and minimally, they're going to treat me like an important part of the process by explaining and by treating me as an equal partner in the process. And it does change culture because if you treat people like they are a problem that you're trying to solve so you don't get sued, they're going to feel it, their coworkers are going to feel it, and you will be impacting your organizational culture and trust.
Are there some practical ways companies can better integrate ADA compliance into their DEI strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Only about 10% of all DEI programs or initiatives actually mention disability. Why is that? That's because I think for a lot of DEI programs, they look at, their colleagues over in the ADA space and say, look, you have a law that protects you, right? Disabled people have a law that protects them. The ADA nationally, and then in the United States, and in most states, at least half of the states, we have carry-on protective laws. There's an actual legal mandate providing protections to people with disabilities. DEI initiatives are voluntary initiatives. They're voluntary. As we can see, especially in the United States right now, they can change overnight in terms of political wins or in terms of board agendas. And so a lot of times DEI programs have really focused on groups, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, whether it is, a religious belief. Those traditional DEI areas have not really included disability, but the reality is when we look at our race, our gender, our LGBTQIA communities, there's also disabled people that are in there. And the goal of a DEI program is really about creating an opportunity for that voice of that group to be at the table. And the ADA only focuses on people who are disabled, where their disability disables them and they need an accommodation to access work or perform work. But there's a ton of people in our organizations with disabilities that don't need accommodations. And we want to make sure that our DEI programs understand that it is important that we've got people at the table, whether they need an accommodation or not. But if they have a disability, that it is seen, it is recognized, and it's part of the decision-making model in an organization. We hire similar people to ourselves, the good and the bad. That's one of the reasons DEI is so important. you had a guest on recently, Jason Carroll, who spoke about this in recruitment. There is this bias, this issue that we have as humans, where when we like someone or we recognize that person, we often will be more apt to hire, promote, or retain them. And so it's important that when we look at who's at the table hiring, evaluating, promoting, that it represents all of those groups. At some point, I hope we get to a point where we've got such a diverse hiring table, such a diverse CEO office, C-suite, that we don't need to have initiatives. But until that day happens, we want to make sure that people with disabilities are also at the table and that we are creating not just a checkbox for accommodation, but truly that we're including them in how we plan for our future workplaces, how we think about laying out offices. People with disabilities have a lot to offer, even if they're not needing a disability accommodation. We want them helping us think about and plan and prepare for the future, just like we want our race, gender, and our LGBTQIA community to be part of it as well.
Rachel, can you share a real world example of a company that has used the ADA to strengthen rather than hinder its workplace culture?
Sure. One of my favorites that I'm going to share is actually not because this changed any of their outcomes, but it changed how the organization felt about the outcome. I work with a very large public transportation agency. And this agency, because of the type of injuries and disabilities and the type of work they do, this organization often found themselves where there would be hundreds, if not nearly 1,000 employees a year who could not be accommodated. And when I was brought in, the main reason they brought us in to audit their program and to help them implement a better interactive process and help them make better reasonable accommodation decisions was because they were losing tens of millions of dollars a year in lawsuits. And when we came in, all we did was implement that four-step process. But with that four-step process, we included conversations, education, explanations, and gathering data to ensure that the decisions being made were clearly able to be identified. The biggest difference, if you look at 3-year difference between when we started and 3 years after, and it's been now 10 years, and the positive, culture changes are still there. But the biggest change is we were still unable to accommodate. We were still medically separating nearly the same amount of employees. So we didn't actually increase accommodations. We didn't increase the ability to say yes to more people. But what we did do is we created more understanding. Because instead of accepting no driving, instead of accepting no heavy pushing or pulling or heavy lifting, instead of simply taking those medical clarifications that we got and having a meeting and telling the employee, no, we can't accommodate, they added an additional interactive process step of asking the healthcare provider or doctor to clarify how many pounds of force can they push or pull, how many pounds can they lift, what does no driving mean? That's an accommodation. Why can't they drive? Is it sitting? Is it gripping the steering wheel? And the major difference is instead of having a meeting where the supervisors or managers could say, no, we can't accommodate heavy, forceful, repetitive, etc. We instead had a conversation after doing more work to say, you're a bus operator and your doctor has indicated you cannot sit for more than 20 minutes at a time before you must stand for 20 minutes. And then explaining why that won't work when you're doing the line that has a 9-hour driving shift. The difference is the employees could look their supervisor either in the eye or on the phone call or on the Zoom call, and they would understand and say, you're right. You're right. I can't be accommodated. And overnight, and again, it's been 10 years now, we stopped seeing lawsuits. We stopped seeing internal grievances. We saw less issues with the unions. They have very powerful unions. Unions were very upset. We are now, my company is still supporting this organization because the unions want us there. This process works. It's not a one-sided, it looks at both the employer and the employee as equal parties to the process. And the goal of it is to create understanding and acceptance. For the employer, less time, less money, less lawsuits, less, bad press. That's all good stuff. For the employees, it's understanding and acceptance. It's feeling like there's a reason why they're not able to continue. And that is such a gift, not only to preserve for them, the pain and suffering they have to go through in a lawsuit, but also if an employee cannot be accommodated, The difference between feeling like my employer doesn't want me to be accommodated, doesn't want to help me, versus understanding why I can't safely or fully do my job. That is a gift to give to someone that helps them accept and move forward. Yes, it reduces litigation, but it also helps these humans that we are helping and managing. It helps them truly understand and move forward. And to this day, we have similar levels of no's. Unfortunately, it's a very physically demanding job, but we have almost no litigation, almost no lawsuits. It's very low nuisance value stuff, less than 30 grand a year, as opposed to multi-million dollars. And this is a very large organization. And we have acceptance and understanding and support and trust that has been built with the unions, with the employees, with the managers. It's a win-win across the organization. I like that example, even though I also love examples where I can say we found a lot more yeses. But I like that example because it's not always about implementing a program or process that forces an employer to do more. Sometimes employers need to understand that a truly successful interactive process, that to comply with the ADA, that what is so critical about it is care enough to get data and care enough to communicate and create understanding and acceptance. And that is just as powerful as finding more yeses often. So that's one of the reasons why I really like kind of that example. And it's a large scale example that we continue to see. Now, in the beginning, they needed someone like me to come in and help them. Now they're completely self-sustainable. It's replicable, it's manageable, it can continue, and it is something that they can manage in-house over the long haul, which is really important in this process.
Is that example in your book?
I don't believe it is in my book, although there are many other examples in my book, but that is one that maybe in version 2 of my book.
Well, these were fascinating insights, Rachel. Thank you very much for sharing all of that with us, and it was great having you on the show.
Thank you so much. This is truly a pleasure, and I appreciate your time.
Support for this show comes from Western Carolina University, a campus of the University of North Carolina system, with the technical assistance of Kelly Minnis.